Should I go ahead? Okay, good evening, everybody. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln College of Journalism and Mass Communications is very pleased to welcome you to the inaugural season of the Hearst Speaker Series. This year's lecture series focuses on diversity and contemporary media. It is our hope that the Hearst series will enhance media creators' and consumers' awareness of issues in a multifaceted, diverse society and encourage dialogue to improve access to and fairness in the media. The series is provided for by an endowment from the Hearst Foundation. The title of tonight's lecture by Bob Ray Sanders is The Media in Living Color or Black and White. Vice President, Associate Editor and Metro columnist for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Bob Ray Sanders has been a professional newspaper, television and radio journalist for 40 years. Bob Ray worked many years at the Dallas-Fort Worth PBS affiliate, where he served as reporter, producer, station manager, and vice president. A 1969 graduate of North Texas State University, he is past president of the Press Club of Fort Worth. He is a member of the Society of Professional Journalists, the National Association of Black Journalists, and the Dallas-Fort Worth Association of Black Communicators. Bob Ray serves on the board of the Mental Health Association of Tarrant County, the advisory board of the AIDS Outreach Center in Fort Worth, and the advisory board of Goodwill Industries. He is professional in residence in the journalism department of Texas Christian University, where he teaches the course Race, Gender, and Mass Media. Bob Ray has received some of journalism's most prestigious awards, among them 5 awards from the Houston, New York, and Chicago film festivals, 5 Dallas Press Club Katie Awards, 3 Corporation for Public Broadcasting Awards, a regional Emmy, a National Association of Black Journalists Award for Best TV Sports Feature, and a National Headliner Award for Outstanding Investigative Reporting. His other honors include an Ethics Award from the TCU Journalism Department, Distinguished Alumni Award, Fort Worth Independent School District, induction into the Hall of Honor, University of North Texas Journalism Department, and the Thomas Jefferson Liberty Award from the Dallas Civil Liberties Union. Please help me to welcome Bob Ray Sanders.
Thank you, Dean, and good evening. Wait a minute. I told y'all I'm from Texas. I mean, when we say good evening, we need a good evening back, you know? How's everybody? Okay, I'm glad to be here. What I will say right away, I'm glad to be in the great state of Nebraska. I forget where I am some days. And I really enjoyed my stay so far. I mean, so the people who were responsible for bringing me here, thank you very much. The dean and associate deans who've been very kind to me, the students that I've encountered over the past day, and I'm sure more that I will encounter over the next day because I've been in a lot of classes today. It's been a fun time. I'm going to promise you that I won't take all the time that you've allotted me, because just as I realize my job is to talk and your job is to listen, I want us to finish our jobs at the same time. So I'm going to try to get through this thing, and I'll try to edit some as I go, so it's not as long as I'd actually planned to begin with. I'm especially pleased to be at a university and in a city, frankly, that doesn't have that much diversity, by what I could tell from going online, but still feels obligated to host a diversity conference. That says something about you, and particularly the Mass Communications and Journalism School. I mean, it says something that other people ought to be able to learn from, including those high-profile media corporations that really don't talk about diversity much anymore, except in a sort of awkward, condescending way they don't talk about diversity anymore, and that bothers me. But I'll get back to that in just a minute. Let me back up a bit. First, although I really don't like to talk long. If you think that I'm going overboard, raise your hand, and I'll skip a couple pages and move right along. Won't offend me at all. I'm used to being told. I was in television. I know what that means. Keep it going. And as I said, I'm really looking forward to talking to more students tomorrow. Let me give you a little of my background information, which may set the tone for this discussion on diversity, a subject I know very well because of where I was born, how I was brought up. You know, I went into this business at a time when it didn't want me. It really didn't want me. And yet I was able to go in and bring my culture, all of my attitudes, my vision, and to talk about a world in which we all share. Now, if you talk to my older brothers and sisters, they would tell you that they knew at a very early age, by the time I was in the 5th grade, that I was going to be a journalist. I was the nosiest person in the neighborhood. When a fire department came down, I interviewed the fireman and went back and told it. My brothers and sisters gave me, on my 11th birthday, a tape recorder, a camera, a little Kodak with an attached flash, and a yellow shirt that had newsprint on it. So they figured that they had predestined me to become a journalist, and I suppose they have. And we talked about this just recently. Our family reunion is always over the Labor Day holiday, and we talked about that just this past weekend. But I can tell you that the media, and certainly certain parts of the media, were not part of my early dreams. Keep in mind, like many young elementary school students, not in the 5th grade, I thought of doing other things, not so much the fireman and the policeman and the truck driver. I did think about being a lawyer, but my father talked me out of that because he said I didn't lie well enough to be a lawyer. And I don't mean to offend any lawyers, but that's what he thought. He thought lawyers had to lie and get away with it, and always got caught in my lies. I thought about being a music conductor or some kind of musician, but unlike the stereotypes, I did not have rhythm, and I was not very talented in music. But there was one other profession that I thought about, and it was being an actor, because I figured my people, the people who looked like me, who had gone through 200 years of what they had gone through, had to act sometimes. We had to learn how to act just to get through those 200 years of oppression. So I said, okay, maybe I can be an actor. But you know what? I talked myself out of pursuing that career. And I'll tell you why. Because you see, at the time that I was growing up in Jim Crow, Texas, it seems like everything I saw on the stage, everything I saw in film, everything I saw on the little television screen was so stereotypical, it just turned me off. And I want you to just pretend just a minute that instead of being in this auditorium, you're actually in a movie theater. I'll give you an idea, because it seemed that every time I went to see a movie as a young kid, every movie seemed to open at the close of the Civil War. And if you pretend you're in the theater, I'll give you an idea of what that was like. You know, the lights would go down, of course. The big silver screen would start shining. The titles would go up. The first scene was of a big white mansion with big white columns. Can you picture some of this? On the balcony of this big white mansion would be this beautiful Southern belle in a white dress with petticoats out to about right here. And for those of you who don't know what petticoats are, Google it. And the thing is, and she see this guy coming down the long lane, coming back to the mansion. And the first line in that kind of movie always came from the lady on the balcony, who would say something like, "Well, I declare, it's Jeffrey. I haven't seen him since the war." Y'all get that picture? And that was all right. But I realized that if I were in that film at that time, I would have the second line, because the second line always came from the guy who would see Jeffrey at about the same time she would, but his line would be, as he ran down with no shirt, torn pants, bare feet, and his line would be something like, Master Jeff, I'm sure he's glad you done come home from D-Wall." And I used to always wonder, why was he glad Massa Jeff was coming home from D-Wall? Because I knew me and I'd be looking for another war to send Massa Jeff to. But media was telling us that. From Birth of a Nation on up. I mean, media was telling us this is what people are. This is how people are. And I really wanted to change that. You know, the poet Langston Hughes, long before I was born, wrote a poem called I Too, I, T-O-O, I also, in which he said, I too sing America. I am the darker brother, and they send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I will sit at the table when company comes, and no one will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they will see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. For I too am America. As I said, Langston wrote that a long time ago, before I was born, and yet I'm here to tell you folks, and students understand this, there are still people eating in America's kitchen. And the media has not figured out a way to deal with the context of telling those stories. And that's what I hope we can accomplish through added diversity, to more awareness of those students, regardless of your ethnicity and race, that you can help shape those communities. You can help tell those stories. And I really do believe this. As I said, I understood those words from the first time I ever read them. And I knew that, you know, we ought to have people able to tell that story, to speak the truth to the people, to tell everybody's story, not some people's story, all of theirs, and tell them well, not in part, tell them well. And I guess that's what I'm also asking. Just to give you a little of my background, as I said, I was born in Texas, Jim Crow. My family goes back 150 years in our county. They pay taxes, and I'll tell you why that's important in just a minute. At the time that I was born, aside from the black clinic run by a black doctor, there were two hospitals in my hometown. And there was a Catholic hospital and the county hospital, the public hospital, that would admit black women to have babies in their hospitals. But in both of those hospitals, black women were relegated to the basement in the colored wards. That's where many people my age were born, in those hospitals. So I've known racism since birth. I've said before in a column I wrote fairly recently, I know how it feels, I know how it sounds, I know how it looks, and because of some of my experiences, particularly in driving through East Texas, where we were often sent to the back of the restaurant or to the back window of a cafe or whatever to get a greasy hamburger, I also know how racism tastes. I know how it tastes. And so when I talk about the media and racism, when I talk about our society and racism, I'm telling you I know what I'm talking about because I've lived it. Now, when it was time for me to enroll in public school, I was sent to a segregated school. I mean, you know Jim Crow. And even though I was in the first grade when the Supreme Court declared that separate but equal schools are inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional, and that we should integrate with all deliberate speed, I still went through 11 more years of a segregated education. Because there were people who thought that little white boys and girls should not be going to school with little black boys and girls. And they fought that all the way through, for 12 years after the Supreme Court decision. Yes, I drank from a water fountain marked colored, rode on the back of the bus, and I heard in one of the classes they were talking about the songs that Coca-Cola had where people were singing America the Beautiful in different languages, and people were upset about that. And I said, well, think of how I felt on the back of the bus, and we had to sing America the Beautiful every day. It's not fun singing that song from the back of a bus or at a colored water fountain. I was barred from downtown theaters and restaurants in public parks. Fort Worth has one of the 5th best zoos in the country now. I could only go one day out of the year. One day out of the year. It also had the largest swimming pool, which, again, we could only go that one day, June 19th, Emancipation Day in Texas. Could only go then. And interesting enough, on June 20th, after June 19th, the authorities drained the pool to fill it up again on June 20th so that white kids wouldn't be contaminated by the water that black kids had been swimming in. Yes, I know what racism is. There was also an amusement section of this park that had a Ferris wheel, that had a merry-go-round. And again, I'm reminded of a Langston Hughes poem, words which he put into the mouth of a small boy, which easily could have been me. The guy walks up to the merry-go-round operator and says, "Where is the Jim Crow section of this merry-go-round, mister? Because I want to ride." You see, down south where I come from, colored and white can't sit side by side. Down south on the train, there's a Jim Crow car. And on the bus, we have to sit in the back. But there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. So where's the horse for a kid that's black? Those are questions that I ask all the time. And as I said, because my parents and grandparents were landowners and paid much taxes for decades, I was not able to use the facilities or the services of all those things that my family had paid taxes for. So you can imagine how that made me feel growing up, and particularly how it made me feel for them, because they had endured a lot more than I had endured. And we felt change was on the way. Through all of that, I grew up reading a daily newspaper, the one I would eventually start working for, the one I just finished another 20 years working for. It was a newspaper that for the most part would not hire anybody who looked like me. No paper in Texas at the time had any black person working as a reporter or a writer or an editor. And that was true of most newspapers, large newspapers in the country. I'm remembering that the Los Angeles Times, after the Watts riots, or during the Watts riots, sent a janitor to cover the riots because they didn't have a black reporter to send to the riots. And so here we were trying to usher in a new era. They wouldn't print a picture of a person who looked like me unless he had been accused of killing a white man or raping a white woman. It was all negative. It was all stereotypical. That was what the media was in my day. When I got ready to go to college and major in journalism, my father thought I was crazy because he was saying, "Where are you going to work? Who's going to hire you? Why would you major in a field that doesn't want you?" And I did it anyway. And as it turned out, things changed a little bit. You know, my family watched the NBC nightly news. They watched the network affiliate news, and yet we never saw anything positive about people who looked like us. But in the early 60s, the civil rights movement was in full swing. And media, almost unbeknownst to itself, was chronicling this era. And what I was seeing happening throughout the South, where the most vicious people standing in the doorway of institutions to keep people out, people sticking their dogs on children in Birmingham, people putting the water hoses on them. The media, without even knowing it, I don't believe, had joined the fight against discrimination and racism. And that's when I really knew that I wanted to be a part of that fight. So I majored in journalism regardless. If it meant I would have to leave the country to do the kind of work that I want, if I had to leave Texas to do the kind of work that I want, I was willing to do that. Now, you think about the sit-ins and the riots, you know, the freedom riders. You think about all those people and what price they paid just so that I could have an opportunity. Even though I already knew that I wanted to be in the media, I definitely knew that I wanted to be part of something that was changing America. And the media did that. I was proud of it. But the media slipped. You see, I wanted to be part of that army with a microphone and a camera and a notebook. I wanted to go out and tell those stories that other people had been telling. Except at the time that I was ready to go to college, as I said, still, nobody would hire me. Now, as it turned out, things changed a bit. But we would soon find out that although the TV had moved to living color, in terms of our race relations, it was still black and white. It was still very much black and white. And I had to deal with that. She said my father thought I was crazy. So in the summer of 1965, he shook his head, wished me well as I went off to college. But it was the riots of 1964 through 1967, Detroit, Newark, Washington, D.C., all of those riots, and of course, including Watts, that the nation was in a quandary. President Johnson appointed, and folks, if you don't know of this commission, you need to go look it up. If you haven't read it in a long time, the report. The Kerner Commission, Johnson set out and created to find out what's causing this disruption. What is it? And they came back with a stern report, knocking our institutions in ways that it had never been done before, for not hiring people, for not following people, for not being fair to people in various communities. But the most important thing, that Kerner Commission knocked the American press. For number one, not covering fairly the riots, just as they have not in recent demonstrations that we've seen in Ferguson and other places. They said that the media was inaccurate. They said that the media, because it had no people who looked like us, was at fault for some of the things that were happening with the disturbances going on in the country. And they recommended that they ought to get on the ball. And it was about that time that just about every large media corporation, especially large newspapers, decided they had to have one. They didn't want more than one. They had to have one. And they went out to get their token. And as I said, I was in that first wave that came along, 1969, 1970, where we were trying to change things. So as I mentioned my father, you can imagine 2 weeks, I was hired right out of college to work for my hometown newspaper. You can imagine my father, who got the paper one morning and saw my name and my photo on the front page. And he spent half the day calling the neighbor, said, yeah, that's his picture on the front page, but he didn't kill nobody. He didn't rape nobody. He ain't in jail. He wrote the story. He wrote the story. I mean, I'm serious. Maybe a little exaggeration there, but that was where it was. And that's the way it was for a while. We went along with that one. But in the middle 70s, late 70s, those of us who had gotten on the inside tried to help change what was on the inside. We tried to bring other people in. And we succeeded for a while. We had diversity workshops. We had recruiting all over the country. We went out and tried to convince editors and news organizations and broadcasts, hey, you got to bring somebody in to help tell these stories. As I said, we did. But I got to tell you, about 2000, those numbers started to dwindle again. Newspapers got in trouble. Some television stations and radio stations got in trouble. The people who were hired last were the first ones to go. Then we had this problem where, students off to college were so discouraged, they weren't ready to major in journalism anymore. So we had to start that pipeline all over again. I think that, when I went to college, the door was closed to me. When I came back, it was cracked a little bit. And there were those of us who tried to keep it open, at least for a little while. When I think back, and I saw the numbers increase and then decline, I wonder, what can we do about it? What could we do about it? Well, you got to start those pipelines again. We got to teach those of you who are not ethnic minorities to be part of the solution, not just criticize. You got to be part of the solution. When the American Society of Newspaper Editors years ago came up with a plan that all of us newspapers bought into, they said that first in the next 5 years, we want to see the number of minorities, ethnic minorities, in newspapers that equal their populations in the country and in those places where they live, those communities. Well, we've never come close to achieving that. Certainly didn't do it in 5 years, haven't done it in almost 30 years. We haven't done it. There are like 37.4% ethnic minorities in this country, and the highest we've ever got is around 13.74% in terms of minority employment in newspapers. So we fail there. Now, they will say, well, you know, we've been declining overall in newspaper population, so it goes with ethnic minorities too. Well, I'm saying that ought to change. As I said, many minorities are choosing other fields. We've had more qualified people today. We need more qualified people today as we did then. And I got to tell you, the institution of media has changed. We got to recognize that. It won't be the same way. As I told you, I grew up in an ancient time when professors in journalism actually described the lead in sexist ways. Quote, the lead of, sorry, you students know what a lead is, right? This is a quote from one of my professors in college. A lead needs to be like a woman's skirt, short enough to be interesting, but long enough to cover the subject. Now today, anybody who used that language would get slapped, would get sued, would, who knows, certainly get fired, probably, or all three. But that's how they did it. We had linotype machines. Go Google that too, because I know you don't know what that is. We had manual typewriters. That was our instrument. But because I had great colleagues, great professors in college, who put aside the racism that so many professors at the time that I went to college had, but in the journalism department, we had people who loved the profession and who wanted good people in it. And they nurtured me. I got to the paper, and I was put between two veteran reporters, again, who nurtured me, who to this day are friends of mine. So I've seen this whole profession. I've been in the ups and the downs, and sometimes it's been like a roller coaster, you know, where the coaster drops from the very top to the who knows where the bottom is. I've seen that happen in media. But despite all that, I've had a great ride. Being here is part of that. I had one of those rides, as I like to say, it was a rocking and rolling kind of ride. It was a James Brown I Feel Good ride. It was a Beatles 8 days a week and Hard Day's Night ride. It was an Aretha Franklin R-E-S-P-E-C-T ride. It was an Elton John Rocket Man ride. I've had the ride, and I'm still on the roller coaster. I'm here to tell you that you're going to be on a roller coaster sometimes, probably. Don't jump out. Don't yell for the operator to stop it. Stay and endure it. And I must admit that in the past few years, the ride has, you know, shaken me a bit, shaken my confidence in what I regard as one of the great professions. But I want to say to these students that are here, and I applaud the students who are here, were you made to come? Yes, you don't have to answer that. I want to say to you that despite the obituaries that are being written for the newspapers and the newspaper industry and the deathbed for journalism, don't believe that. Journalism is not on its deathbed. It really isn't. But I say to you that I'm optimistic, partly because of some of the students I met here today who showed me a willingness to go after the skill, a compassion and a passion that they are ready to enter this profession and make changes that some of us aren't able to do. So to the existing journalists, the journalists who are here, to those would-be journalists, I say to you, we still need you. Don't believe that all the doors are closed. Some of them are, but not all of them. We still need good people. We need you, regardless of your race or gender. We need those who have learned the trade well, those who, despite improvements in technology, want journalism to be a watchdog rather than a lap dog or a dirty dog, or as we've seen lately, a mad dog. That's what we need in those people who are going to be with us. We need those more interested in the fact than in rumor or gossip. Those who think the Fourth Estate really means something more than bad real estate, we need you. And those of you not just prepared to ask questions, but also prepared to listen, to learn from your communities and the people in them, we need you. But I'd be remiss, as I draw to a close, I think I've cut out a few things, be remiss if I told you what we don't need. Vinette Carroll wrote a play on Broadway called Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope, and one of the songs in it is lyrical, obviously. It says, I don't need your platitudes. I don't need your pity. I don't need your study group or your ad hoc committee. I don't need your sympathy, not without your respect. I don't need your city councilor and its benign neglect. I don't need a cussing out every time my rent is due. And I don't need your doctor studying my IQ. I don't need your theory from some book you've read. And I sure don't need your welfare workers peeping under my bed. All that I need is less fatback, more greenback, and you off my back. That's all I need. So young people, let me tell you what we don't need, and I'll bring this to a close. We don't need people who will run in packs, as I see often today. Like wolves, they run, going after a piece of meat, going after a prey. We don't need those kind of people. We need people who will cover stories, legitimate and otherwise, simply because the stories are the issue du jour. We don't need that. We don't need, if you will, those who can't see the connection between the people of South Africa, South Sudan, South Korea, and the people of South Dallas or East Austin or whatever side of Lincoln that is deprived. If you can't see those connections, we don't need you in this profession. We don't need you in this business if you think that the value of one's life is determined by the color of their skin, their net worth, or the side of town in which they grew up. This profession doesn't need any more people who care more about what happens in people's bedrooms than they do about what happens in boardrooms and legislative sessions and in hearing rooms and executive offices around the country. We don't need any more peeping Toms or peeping Marys. We don't need that kind of journalism anymore. And we don't need any more editors in the newspaper business or news directors in the broadcasting business whose only contact with the communities they serve come during the day when they drive to work and then drive home on overhead expressways. We need people who get to know their communities. Lorraine Hansberry, the author of A Raisin in the Sun, and again, this is to you young people, because I really came by to ask you to care about yourselves, obviously, care about your classmates, but care about your larger community. Lorraine Hansberry died at a very young age, at the age of 39. And as a writer, I loved her so because she had this ability to continue to write even when she was her sickest. I mean, she was sick for over 2 years. And sometimes she could only have strength to write one page or one paragraph. And after she died, her husband Robert looked through her notebook that she kept by her bed. And a couple of days before Lorraine died, she had written the words, "Yes, I care. I care about it all, because it takes too much energy not to care." That's how I feel today. Don't care about a little bit of it, some of it, part of it. Care about it all, because it takes too much energy not to care. And I'll leave you with these words from another poet, Carolyn Rogers, a poet from Chicago. Now, I got to tell you something about Chicago. Carolyn grew up in the 60s, too. And she was a rabble-rouser. Carolyn got up one morning, she cut off all of her hair. She changed her name to Imani Majua. She changed her religion. She went out on the streets of Chicago, and some people said she just acted a fool. But she said every Saturday night she would get this call from her mother, and her mother would say, "Carolyn, girl, why don't you come on home? Come on back to church." And Carolyn said after 5 years, she went back home to her mother's house. And that first morning after she had gotten back, she said she got up one morning and looked in the mirror and talked to herself. And don't think that's funny, because I do that now. But she said the first thing she said to herself was, the fact is, I don't hate anybody anymore. Can you imagine what the world would be like if tomorrow morning we all got up, looked in the mirror, and said, you know, the fact is, I just don't hate anybody anymore. We wouldn't have what happened in Savannah if that 21-year-old boy got up and said, you know, the fact is, I don't hate anybody anymore. But Carol said the other thing she noticed, she said she found herself saying, you know, there is a well in me. There is a well in me. And if I open up, I can flow forever. Young people, there's a well in you. There's a deep well that's been tapped and primed. And I say to you tonight, and I'll say it to anybody else who will give me the chance, just open up and start flowing. Anybody got any questions about anything? Anybody want to contradict anything I said? Anybody want to challenge anything I said? I'm used to being challenged. Yes, sir.
I'm about the same thing as you. So what I think I'm observing is we're into another big cultural shift. Unpredictable, as it was in the 70s and before that. What's your read? What do you see, and are you optimistic about the cultural shift?
No, and while I told students earlier today that I'm optimistic about them, I'm not optimistic about the leaders in this country, because that cultural shift is being dictated by those leaders who are teaching people to be afraid of their neighbors, who are teaching people to despise their neighbors, who are teaching people to literally hate other Americans, because they're teaching them that what they don't have is because of somebody else. And I see that divide getting wider. The chasm is greater than I think I've ever seen it, even during the days of the civil rights movement. And they ought to be embarrassed, and we ought to make them embarrassed, but they're still doing it. I mean, it's every day. And so that's where I see it coming from. And it's sad. I'm talking about our state leaders, many of our local leaders, and certainly members of Congress who have not demonstrated to me any leadership whatsoever. I mean, except for a handful. So I'm sad about that. Yeah. Yeah. You know what? I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up, and if I'd had time, I probably would have talked about this. I don't know how many of you know the name John Howard Griffin. You know that name? He wrote a book called Black Like Me. John turned his skin dark, went into the South around 1959. In addition to 2 or 3 black newspapers in Fort Worth and 2 or 3 in Dallas, who did the local news basically, and certainly who talked about things like lynchings and things going around the country and the movement. There was a magazine publishing company out of Fort Worth called the Good Publishing Company. They're the ones who funded, they published a magazine called Sepia. It's like what Ebony is now. I did my thesis, my senior thesis on the black press and its contributions, and one of the people I talked to was John Howard Griffin. He was still very ill at the time, and we didn't have a chance to talk long. But he talked about the importance of the black press, and in fact, even after he had gone through the South, even after he had published the 3 articles in Sepia, after he had written the book Black Like Me, he continued to do some writing. And his ex-wife and her new husband have published some more books by him. But there was an active black press, and there was some, like the Chicago Defender and others, which was a daily, by the way, led the fight against lynchings in the South. I mean, they actually sent reporters to the South who were threatened, who were, some, really done bad, jailed, all of that kind of thing. But yes, there was a black press. But the problem with the black press was that it had very limited funding. very short staff. Couldn't pay. Many of the people were volunteering for that, and most of them were weeklies. That you just couldn't really do the kind of thing that you would want to do. But yes, there was. No. The first thing they did, and the same thing with broadcast. The first thing they did, the first person hired at the Star Telegram was hired 6 months before I graduated. But he had gone to my same high school and he had graduated from the same college. Now, and we were both hired because we were both native of Fort Worth. We, had gone to North Texas, which had a great journalism school at the time. And they wanted somebody who knew it, but the first person they hired was not in journalism. He had gotten a degree in English and was working for IBM at the time. So they went and got him. The first, and in Dallas-Fort Worth, the 5 o'clock news was created to hire the first black woman co-anchor on the news. They created that, and that's as people stood on the steps of the FCC threatening to challenge the license on the last day that they could renew the license. And they hired a woman who, again, didn't have journalism background, but I think she was a model or something like that. And that's what, they were looking for looks and the color. But by 1970, we had 3 black reporters on the Star Telegram, which was twice as many as most in the country, and certainly twice as many as all in Texas. And we were all growing up in the same hometown. Yes, sir.
So with the advent of
How is covering the minority community?
well, how have publications saying that
Yeah.
or black how has that shaped the way that maybe more traditional
Well, certainly with the Advocate, they have led the discussion on many gay issues. They publish, and the mainstream media felt obligated to follow. They were detailing incidents in the country, police brutality, other kinds of attacks on people because they were gay or whatever, and the mainstream media had to follow them. So they definitely set the standard. In the old days, they would occasionally play or pay attention to the black press if there was something very important, but they were rarely right about it. They wouldn't go for it. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Fort Worth in 1959, spent 2 days there, stayed at a home. A book I did on a black photographer who covered the black community for 50 years was the only person who documented that visit because the Star Telegram would not cover Martin Luther King Jr. And he was already a national figure by then, international figure by then. But they didn't do it. And so it had not been for this black photographer who covered schools and everything else, weddings and you name it. He covered all these giants. Jackie Robinson, who came to town, Joe Louis, Thurgood Marshall, Ralph Bunche, all of these famous people who came to town, the mainstream media did not cover. But the black press was there to do that. Any other questions? Well, great, folks. Hey, thank y'all very much for being here. Enjoyed it.